Tony, as you know, one of the themes currently in this season of my channel is fascism, and what it is and whether or not people are using the term correctly, and who even cares whether the term is being used correctly. All of those are questions and concepts I've been covering. So you're incredibly well-read, scholarly, brilliant book writer, all that stuff. Is Donald Trump a fascist? And is the MAGA movement a fascist movement?
I would say no. Donald Trump is not a fascist. There are people in his government with fascistic tendencies and beliefs. People often point to Stephen Miller or Pete Hegseth. But MAGA itself is actually such a broad coalition. It encompasses people who hardly agree on a lot of things. Like, I mean, really, it's demagogically tied to the cult of Donald Trump. Like, MAGA includes Christian nationalists, includes economic neoliberals, neoconservatives, like Marco Rubio, and people who, you know, are white nationalist sympathizers. And also just people who are general, I would say, American nationalists, who aren't particularly racialists. I think that's what Trump is, if he has an ideology. When Trump says, make America great again, I don't think he's talking about the 1800s, the 1920s, or even the 50s. I think he's talking about the 1980s and 90s. But within the MAGA movement, it did have its radical wings. So you had the Gripers, right? Nick Fuentes. I think Nick Fuentes is, it's not controversial to call him a fascist. I mean, he kind of embraced it himself pretty openly for quite a bit. Now, when I use the word fascism, it's not solely a moral category. You know, like, that's why I think people use it inaccurately, because it just means bad thing. It's like, because it's self-evident to most people that fascism is bad, but it's like, to actually like understand things, I think we have to break it down. And I think Nick Fuentes' rise is really symptomatic of what I would call like the boy who cried fascist. So, you know, the story of the boy who cried wolf. It's like, oh, there's a wolf coming, and but he's lying and there isn't. And then when there actually is, the wolf comes and kills everybody because no one's listening. Well, that's how I view the rise of fascism. For a long time, people have been using the word fascism to describe anything right-wing. And then there's this tendency to also create anything, to call anything fascist if it's right-wing and a little bit kind of populist. So if it has some economically left-coded ideas with right-wing ideas and any mix of authoritarianism, that's fascism all of a sudden. I think using this word so loosely, because people forget that this word was used to describe George W. Bush. It was used to describe Reagan even, which is crazy to think about. And even Trump, like, I think using it to describe Trump was always quite exaggerated. And doesn't mean there's not dangers in the Trump administration. Doesn't mean Trump's not probably the most authoritarian president since, give or take, well, I would say since Bush. Bush is pretty authoritarian, actually. So, you know, it doesn't mean it's not bad. But, like, I think because of this word of fascism has been used so loosely, it's lost its meaning for a lot of people. So you have a lot of people now embracing fascism unironically. Like, it's funny because, yeah, I'm sure you've seen this on Instagram or whatever. Like, if you like any anti-Israel meme, you suddenly get fed all of these like Nazi memes, these anti-Semitic stuff. It's crazy. It like thinks that just because I have some slightly like what are considered right-coded by today's standards views and left-coded views plus anti-Israel, it starts feeding me all of these unironic memes from Nazi accounts.
Right, from people who self-identify as fascist, because when you use the term, when everyone's a fascist, no one is. It's syndrome. When everyone's super, no one is. And when everyone's fascist, no one is. And yeah, it's a problem. But why, like, in some sense, Tony, because I'm very practical, why not just fascism equals bad? That seems like a pretty useful definition. I mean, you said most people know that fascism is self-evidently bad. And we're talking about the fascism of like Nazi Germany and Italy and all that shit and authoritarian regimes. And we can get into the detail of what that actually means. But like, what's wrong with just being fascist is bad? I say degenerate all the time. I have a word that generally means just bad. It's degenerate. So what's wrong with calling people fascist when you mean bad?
Well, I wouldn't really object to fascism being bad, but the thing is,
right? But using them interchange, like when because people just call people fascist, they just mean person I don't like. What's wrong with that? Like, is that not useful politically in orienting people's?
Because fascism and other forms of authoritarianism arise due to very different circumstances. A lot of the time, they're different in character. It's also that you can't discern like who is a greater threat and who isn't. Sometimes it's a much more better tactic instead of, sometimes what's often not considered when it comes to politics is, what you're doing going to make your enemy worse or better? And a lot of people take this tactic of just opposing everyone on the right, or leftists or right-wing people will oppose everyone on the left. But what that often does is you fail to discern who's actually a bigger threat and who's more dangerous. And what that ends up doing is, like actual fascism can grow. I mean, also just like practical use, like when you do have a fascist threat, people won't take it seriously because people have been using it flippantly before. And if you use it to describe things that are just like kind of genuinely popular, like, I don't know, securing the border and being critical of globalism or nationalism itself, I mean, those are all very popular things, as you can see in the world zeitgeist at the moment. If you just keep calling that fascist, I mean, then a lot of people are probably just going to be like, okay, I guess I'm a fascist. I mean, that's how I became a socialist, so I have socialist views. And part of that was due to me basically believing in social democratic policies in high school and having a conservative McCarthyite high school teacher who was like, oh yeah, this is a socialist in the class. This is a socialist in the class. So I was like, all right, I'll take it.
Yeah, exactly. Someone calls you a label often enough.
You communist. In America, they wouldn't call you communist. And I remember they called Bernie Sanders a communist. They called Zoran Mamdani a communist. And it's like,
yeah.
Like, is this useful? Like, it's not. I think
right. Well,
and fascism are just Cold War scare words for the right and left.
Yeah, I agree. And if someone calls you or someone a name over and over again, you just start to you don't care and go, okay, fine. Call me socialist, call me fascist, because that's why I make the joke of, do you love your own family more than, someone else? Oh, you must be a fascist because you're prioritizing your own tribe or something like that. It's the same meme. Okay, well then, what is the most practical, politically pragmatic definition of fascism that people should be using who are, interested in politics, politically aware? Because you can go down to the absolute deep historical, super detailed definition, or you can do the fascism equals bad person definition. What is the key? What do you think is the most useful definition of fascism, and what are the characteristics of it?
Generally speaking, when it comes to understanding ideologies, I think it's quite simply the best approach to look at the people who explicitly espouse those ideologies and what they did. So when it comes to fascism, defining fascism, we could break it into three sort of parts. There's what is fascism based on what explicit avowed fascists said they wanted to do, said they believed in, and what they did in practice, because that's always important, like communism, for example, or Marxism, Leninism, because there's many different kind of communisms, which, Soviet style communism and whatnot. You have to look at what its advocates said and also what it did. What are the similarities of its regimes in power? And what the conditions are that arose it. So when we say, why not just talk about right-wing authoritarianism? Well, let's start off with some contradictions. So, what if I told you that Salazar in Portugal, who is a right-wing dictator who lasted a very long time.
It's my friend Jarrett's favorite Portuguese dictator of all time.
Oh boy. Well, he's not very popular in Portugal, I'll tell you that.
I know, I'm also joking.
Yeah.
Jarrett studies Portuguese history. He's not a fan of Salazar.
But he locked up fascists and actually crushed the fascist movement in Portugal. He's right beside Spain.
He's right beside what?
He was right beside Spain. I mean, Portugal is
sure,
geographically close to Spain.
Yeah, the Frankists or Franco.
Yeah, there's huge differences between these systems, right? So what is fascism and what makes it important? So first off, this idea that fascism is like the far right, communism is the furthest thing on the far left, these are not very accurate frameworks. Fascism is not conservative. That's another important thing. Fascism is not conservative. Fascism is a revolutionary ideology. And I don't think revolutionary inherently means good or bad, you know?
Sure.
But it's a revolutionary ideology because its goal is not stability. It's complete and total transformation. Fascism, another characteristic of it, it has a total view of society. It wants to create society in the image of the ideology of its party. That is supposed to be the sole ruling party. So it believes in dictatorship, but not just any dictatorship, a dictatorship that shapes society itself. So that's why it often gets called totalitarianism. And you know, because some people think that this is like a propagandistic word. I mean, Mussolini invented the word totalitarianism. You know, he called it stato totalitario, the total state. And part of that was that it was the idea that everything should be subordinated to the nation. Communism has a, not, I wouldn't say all communism, but definitely Marxism, Leninism, Bolshevism as it's called. Some people call it Stalinism. But that view, that communist tendency has a totalitarian component, as many people agree, except them. Because it does, while having very different goals from fascism, very different goals, it does seek to shape society through the ideology of the party. It wants to create what the party thinks is a communist society. It wants to socially engineer people. There's a lot of other similarities we could get to, but basically fascism is, you know, some people call it paleogenetic ultranationalism because it's based on this return to a mythic society.
Sounds like a Harry Potter spell.
Yeah, I mean, like for texts, I would recommend for what are good fascism books. You know, Roger Griffin is the most famous guy, but I would say the best one is simply for practical purposes. Eugene Weber's Varieties of Fascism.
What about Stanley Payne?
He's really good, and actually Stanley Payne's really good, but he's too long for most people to properly read because he's just.
I have Stanley Payne.
He's very long. Stanley Payne's books on Spain are excellent, actually. I've read a lot of his work on Spain, like his one on phalangism. But with Eugene Weber, it's just a shorter book, and it's also like looks at every fascist regime that's existed. So what's fascist regimes have existed? The first one was Mussolini's Italy. And you have Nazi Germany. Nazi Germany is a very different type of fascism, but it was explicitly inspired by it and explicitly was fascist. It's just a different sort of a very racialist sort. You had Catholic fascism in Spain with phalangism, which was then kind of contained and subordinated after its founder's death, Antonio Primo de Rivera. It was subordinated by General Franco, who merged the phalangists with a kind of moderate, very different Catholic right-wing faction that actually had stark disagreements. Fascists kind of are a little bit, fascists in Spain were phalangists. They often describe Franco kind of the way that like a lot of communists describe Stalin, like sort of like a betrayer of the revolution. And you know,
was Franco hardcore Catholic?
Oh yes.
Okay.
But he wasn't, I mean, most of the real serious fascism scholars believe Franco's Spain wasn't really fascist. Like it basically co-opted fascism. It did horrible things. You know, it did horrible things as did like Pinochet, right? But you know, these aren't like, in terms of their practice, he stopped trying to create a total state. And he opened up the economy. I mean, this is to like tourism and all of that. And ultimately didn't really care about socially engineering everyone in society to fit the fascist image. And fascists believe in the closed society, not the open society. So it's you know, there's this huge differences. You got Hungary's Iron Guard. Sorry, it was the Romania's Iron Guard. That was a fascist movement. You have the Arrow Cross in Hungary, which was kind of like a puppet regime installed by the Nazis. And you got the short-lived Austrian fascists. So you also got one in like Croatia, but these are not as important. For the big ones, what defines fascism is, I would say, this is what's controversial to a lot of leftists. It's a form of right-wing socialism.
Right-wing socialism?
Yes. Now, I mean...
You mean like MAGA communism? Donald Trump is a fascist.
definitely not. But like with socialism, this is what's interesting about it. I mean, various groups have claimed socialism. Socialism is not owned by the Marxists. It's not owned by the anarchists. It's not owned by the social democrats. It's been used by all kind of people. Bismarck, coined the term National Socialism. He meant something very different from what Hitler was doing with Nazism, obviously. But it's socialist in that it has a collectivistic ideal and an ideal that believes in like the common interests of the people, the Volk, right? What's interesting is that like while socialists who are of the more Marxist sort or of the anarcho-syndicalist sort or just like kind of more worker-oriented socialists, Republican socialists for that matter, for example, I tend to lean on the Republican end. They believe in more like, ownership, self-management, the transfer of power. Essentially, they see socialism and democracy as the same thing, which is that democracy is just the balance of power between elites, a distribution of political power. Socialism is the distribution of economic power. In the 20th century, socialism got redefined to mean basically state ownership, common ownership, which meant public ownership, which meant state ownership. So that was true not just for the fascist regimes, but that became true of a lot of social democracies. It became true of Bolshevism, ironically. Lenin did not see it that way. But Stalin, when he collectivized all the farms, which was largely a war policy that he did in order to basically squeeze all the grain from the peasants so he could go sell it for artillery so he could fight the Germans and the British, which he thought were teaming up. He, called that socialism largely as a way to legitimize that. And ever since then, the bureaucracy of the Soviet Union and all the other communist bureaucracies found it convenient to actually call themselves and say, like, this is what socialism is, just government control. Right? Kind of like how the Catholic Church, back when it was the hegemonic power, it would say, oh, well, it's bad. Merchants are bad because it's profit and we want everything to be held in common, which really meant
give it to us.
By the church.
Yeah. Didn't Roosevelt praise Mussolini, and didn't a lot of people compare Roosevelt's FDR or New Deal program and a lot of the New Deal policies to La Fascista?
So this is very crucial because fascism, when it first emerged, did not see itself as a right-wing phenomenon. In fact, it would often use the term neither left nor right. You see this used by Mussolini. You see it used by Oswald Mosley in England. You see it used by the French fascists, which never came to power either. And Hitler himself, although Hitler's Hitlerian fascism comes more explicitly from the right. It comes from a lot of retired German army generals and the Freikorps and really disgruntled right-wingers who get further radicalized. In Italy, it comes largely from former socialists, former communists even. And what is the root of that? A large part of the origin of fascism in Italy is a result and a reaction to the internationalism of communism, the internationalist aspect of Bolshevism. This is really crucial because none of the leftists talk about this. People on the right often don't either, unless they're kind of being hyperbolic. Because that's the thing. You'll see this internationalism gets turned into a lot of weird conspiracies. But it begins in what was in the rational kernel of truth, which was that there was a Bolshevik idea of spreading revolution all across the world, communist revolution. Mussolini, used to admire Lenin. In 1914, he said very positive things about Lenin. He said positive things about Lenin pretty much all the way up until 1918, when Lenin gave up parts of the Russian Empire in the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, which, by the way, also pissed off the other faction of the socialists and led to the Civil War. It's another interesting thing. So this internationalist current of Bolshevism, which was, it's all about it. It's all about the international revolution, not the national interest. This created huge divisions in the socialist movement. And this caused Mussolini also supported the First World War, Italy entering the First World War, which was not very popular with socialists because they thought, okay, it doesn't matter. All the imperialist powers are bad. So let's just oppose all of them, not side. Mussolini thought this was very unpatriotic and didn't like that. So, you have a bunch of people gravitate away from Bolshevism, but still like the socialist ideal. There's also a move away from class struggle. That's important. So while fascism is a form of socialism, it's one that is very divorced from class struggle. That it actually starts to see the project not as one in which you want the interests of the dominated classes to prevail, but rather just this kind of balance to quell the class conflict. So you see the fascists, they become strike breakers. They start, the black shirts, they start basically terrorizing unions. And they're largely youth organizations. Fascism, the great irony of fascism is it originated a lot like how Antifa did. So Antifa is largely a youth movement, and it's a street movement that goes and beats up fascists on the street.
By a bunch of dispossessed young men with nothing better to do at their time.
And fascism, fascism was that, a youth movement, like the black shirts at least, and they had the Hitler youth movement as well. Emerged largely as like this youth movement that was beating up a bunch of unionists on the street. So they were seen as kind of a nuisance by a lot of the ruling order, but part of the ruling order, including the King of Italy, started to see them as potentially useful in containing the socialist movement. So when it came down to the disintegration and collapse of the socialist movement and the broader left and liberals, so you had a fracture of social democrats and liberals, then a split between the communists and socialists. Very complicated things happened in Italy. A big part of that is because the communists, especially the communists in Italy, side with the Russians. So they join the Communist International. And they believe in the International Revolution. They get seen by the other socialists as people who are doing no more than propagating Russian interests. And while it's easy to see that as a propaganda tactic, the fact is the Comintern, this idea of spreading the International Revolution, did get used by the Soviet Union to basically spread its influence. That's what it did. Like, that's how it conquered Eastern Europe, basically. And it also spread Soviet influence all across Africa to these sort of like regimes that called themselves Marxist-Leninists.
Yeah, right. The ultimate form of white European colonization was in the form of garbage Marxism that ruined the economies of many African nations.
And you could say, right, it's not like, at least they didn't create like, they didn't do like Bengal famine, genocide famine, but they did famines in their own countries. But like, there's all that disaster. But with Marxism, Leninism, I mean, even Mao actually called the Soviet Union imperialist. And the Soviet Union wanted to nuke China when it was getting too powerful, and actually asked the United States if it could do that.
To nuke China?
Yes, the Soviet Union and China were closer to going to war with each other than they were with the United States, which is
during the Cold War?
Yeah, during the Cold War. This is after, like Khrushchev and Kennedy sort of like peace up, like after the Cuban Missile Crisis. Yeah. So after that, it really becomes, and that's why, U.S. teams up with China, Nixon meets with Mao and all that. They see it as a way to pit them against each other.
Interesting. Is this because China had a more like nationalist, like Han Chinese racialist view, or?
It had a very, well, now it has a Han Chinese racialist view increasingly, but it didn't actually back
under Mao. It was
It did have a nationalist. It did have,
Okay.
This is another fact about so a lot of people, liberals and leftists, will say anything that's nationalist and socialist is fascist. I mean, all the Marxist-Leninist regimes, except the Soviet Union, which is a very unique, peculiar thing, were nationalist socialism. So like China comes out of the National Liberation Movement, Vietnam, anti-colonial National Liberation Movement. And a lot of the anti-colonial movements that the Soviet Union gives arms to in Africa, they're nationalist socialist movements. With that, the thing is, that's Soviet influence. To bring that back to Italy, though, so a lot of people distrust this internationalism from the very beginning as just a form of Russian expansionism. And that caused, some people to just break from communism. They became nationalist social democrats. Then some people became fascists, right? In Italy, the ideology of the black shirts was seen as convenient for the ruling class to temporarily stop the rise of the union movement. I would say like the left, the rise of communism, but also I would just say workers, because workers were very powerful in Italy, as they were in a lot of countries at the time. So what the fascists did when they took power is they subordinated the workers under one union, a state-controlled union. And they basically said that they were helping the interests of both the rich and poor. They did do things to actually kind of help the poor in some ways. They did also cut wages dramatically, did impose austerity. So like they kind of ended up actually pissing off the ruling class in the longer term. They also pissed off the Catholic Church, which caused them to rename their whole country. Italy ended up being renamed to the Italian Social Republic after it started seeing the Catholic Church as something actually opposed to it. Because that's the thing. Italy, fascist Italy had a totalitarian view. Like in many ways, Mussolini and the fascists adopted a similar view as the Bolsheviks, which is they want to create a total society of harmony. But they believed that class struggle was not the way, that they want to contain class struggle, and that it should be the nation first. But it was a totalitarian view in that they wanted to subordinate everything to the nation. So society to them didn't have any value in itself. It had value only insofar as it serves the nation. And the nation was to be represented not by the people who elect the government and its coalitions, but by this party. And the party was the state, and the state is the people. This is what totalitarianism is.
And that's why FDR so admired Mussolini, because FDR was a raging Democrat who took 4 terms.
Earlier on. So he did earlier on. He turned against them. And so did John Dewey, who is one of the founders of modern progressivism. He also praised Mussolini because they saw it as something that would like keep aspects of Bolshevism, but essentially like contain, like keep aspects of the modernizing project that you could say was happening in Europe. Because that's the thing, fascism is a modernizing project, so is communism is a modernizing project. They were not anti-modern. It's why Julius Evola, right, who's a far-right thinker, actually ended up opposing Italian fascism later on because he thought it is too modern. It was too progressive. Interestingly, right? And that's another thing you got to see. Italian fascism
because it was post-racial.
So Italian fascism wasn't the furthest thing on the social right. It was actually on the center between the left and the Catholic Church on social issues. That's how it saw itself anyway. So it was definitely to the right of Bolshevism, which, you know, earlier on believed in really crazy ideas. I mean, well, for its time and maybe for today's time too, it believed in ideas like less crazy for today's time. So it believed in full divorce rights, women's rights, but more controversially, and I think more disturbingly, was the abolition of the family, the collective child rearing. Yes, the Bolsheviks did experiment with that before realizing that that was a terrible idea and that quickly abandoned it. And then none of them, they all stopped doing that.
In Russia, they experimented with this?
Very earlier on, yes. In the early days of the Russian Revolution, they did collective child rearing. So did Mao, but except Mao was a little bit less steal your kids, more like lets everyone be in collective canteens and stuff. With the Bolsheviks, they tried it, they abandoned it. Then Stalin basically realized, okay, you know what? Like the traditional values work better. We're just going to bring that back. And they kept that, except they lacked some things. Like they decriminalized abortion again after Stalin because they saw that people were having abortions anyway. So, yeah, it's complicated. But the real interesting thing is, you know, fascism and communism in practice is Bolshevism had this idea of all power to the workers' council. So it was supposed to be a dictatorship of the proletariat. It quickly became dictatorship of the party as you had the Civil War, and they used that as an excuse to build a dictatorship that it was supposed to be temporary and made it permanent. And the party became the dictatorship of the proletariat. The workers' councils existed, but is nothing more than really a safety valve. It's kind of like a rubber stamp to like approve the legislation of the Politburo, because if you didn't, you just kind of get disappeared out of nowhere. Because that's another thing. Imagine if Trump controlled the FBI fully, or the CIA fully, like he could just get them to like execute whoever he wants. Well, that's what a totalitarian regime is, right? It can do that. What's funny is that they also ended up subordinating the workers' unions all under one union controlled by the state. And they said, oh, the collective interest, this whole people. Yet there was class struggle, but class struggle just got used to purge people who are like opposing power blocks, whether it be the kulaks who own their own farms, or whether it be just people who disagreed. They would get deemed as having bourgeois ideology. They would get purged in the name of class struggle. But you still had the structure of everything controlled by the state. What's interesting is that fascism said it was going to do that from the very beginning. So in practice, fascism, Bolshevism created both totalitarian regimes with total state control of everything, except the fascists were cool with the capitalists up to a point. You know, they were cool with fascists as long as they obeyed the party. Kind of like China today. If you look at China today, they have very, flourishing capitalism. But if you go against the party or, challenge the party, you get Jack Mod, you get kind of a little talk, you get disappeared and come back. So look, it's not hard to see why the ruling class kind of preferred fascism to Bolshevism in a lot of places, but a lot of people could see it very early on. Both of these things were very dangerous. And Mussolini, mind you, was not like racialist because Italy wasn't really a race. Italy isn't a race. Italy is a nation and is defined by the language of being Italian, the language Italian, right? Because Italy includes people who are genetically actually extremely different, like southern Italy versus the north, who are closer to Austrians.
Sicily versus Lombardy versus Milan, all that,
So nationalism was seen as very unifying. Fascism and Phalangism in Spain was seen as largely a kind of totalitarian Catholic project in the name of like Spanish culture being inherently Catholic, and unifying Spain also in response to separatism in the Basque country and in Catalonia, which they opposed. And if you look at Nazi Germany, what was very different about it is it kind of had a trans-racial project. So it believed in one like race that not just in one country, it believed in the Aryan race. It started off more talking about the German people, but when it was trying to define what the German people were, it had to come up with a myth. And that's the thing. Germans are also ethnically kind of all over the place, right? But the myth of the Nazis was much broader and strange. So it was this Aryan race, and they had to always redefine it. Like Nazi ideology is notoriously weird and filled with all kind of crazy myths.
Yeah, and very pagan.
Bizarre of all of them. But part of that was like, it was far more anti-Semitic. I mean, if you look at Italy, Mussolini had no problem with Jews until the Italians tried to go invade Africa and failed and needed the help of the Germans to build an alliance against the Soviets. And the Italians were so weak that the Germans ended up cuckolding them and told them to basically hand over their Jews. And that's what they did. By the way, Stalin handed over a bunch of communists to Hitler during the brief little pact, the Nazi-Soviet pact.
Ribbentrop-Molotov or whatever it is.
Yeah. Nick Fuentes also really likes Stalin. It's,
that's fair. Well, we can come to that.
We come back to that.
I mean,
just to tie that together, so it doesn't sound like a hodgepodge. So, like, because of where, like, you start to see these similarities, but the big difference is clearly in this kind of internationalism and in anti-capitalism. Bolshevism has like an anti-capitalism. Many people on the left distance themselves from Bolshevism or abandoned it, opposed to it. Most famously, George Orwell, a democratic socialist, because he saw that the bureaucracy just became the capitalist, the ruling class, in that their anti-capitalism was just an excuse for more concentration of power within the party. Fascists were cool with capitalists as long as they were subordinated to the party, and also they came to power in large part because of certain capitalists backing them. Like Mussolini, as I said, was convenient for parts of the ruling class for him to temporarily quash the labor movement. In Germany, he was elected democratically, and there were like a lot of businesses that backed him. A lot who didn't, but a lot of industrialists did. Like Siemens is a famous, business that gave a lot of money to Hitler. A lot of wives of rich men gave money to Hitler. That's another interesting thing. It's like not clear as to whether the husbands knew or whether it was a way to do it indirectly.
Interesting.
But what Nazism? So like, if fascism in some sense is kind of a mirror of Bolshevism, right? In a response to it, what becomes of Nazism? It's kind of like a double-headed monster. because it adopts the mirror of the worst things in Bolshevism and the worst things in Western imperialism. By that, I mean mainly British and French colonialism, as well as American racial ideology. Because racial ideology, modern racism as we know it, is actually a very modern phenomenon, like this idea of scientific differences between races and races like whites, you know, like these are very newer constructs. You start to get this really scientific racism in England and France. It spreads into America. You know, progressives, by the way, totally end up embracing this. So like progressives embrace eugenics the hardest. Some people on the right were skeptical, not because they really cared about blacks all that much, but because they didn't believe in the science. It's a little funny detail. So when you get that, like Hitler, you know, in Mein Kampf really admires this aspect of like British colonialism. He admires that in the racial ideology and segregation in America. He kind of fuses like this totalitarian organization and discipline of the Bolshevik model, the secret police, which the Bolsheviks invented, you know, as the Cheka and became the NKVD before the CIA was ever invented. You know, it's a modern deep state. Nazism adopts that and adopts that like aspect of colonialism. So you get this like regime type of totalitarianism, but a kind of imperial quest and thirst for ever more expansion that you have.
Sprung.
Yeah, and we know how that ended. I mean, they end in Italy. I mean, they tried to colonize Africa and failed horribly. They tried to colonize parts of Eastern Europe and also, you know, got defeated. And ultimately, they destroyed their nations. I mean, the amount of rebuilding they had to do. Germany would be like Vietnam if it wasn't built up by the Americans after, right? And in the case of Italy, I mean, Italy was built up by the Christian Democrats, who are social democrats, who are a little conservative, you know, for the
Angela Merkel's.
Well, in Italy, they were actually much more left-wing in their economics, the Christian Democrats, yeah. But that's a different story. But yeah,
yes, very
like
much so.
That conquest, you saw it immediately, this like constant drive to expand, and it's ultimately the fascism's most self-destructive aspect is its conquest. And you see it leak out today. I'll say this. Fascists often start off as saying that they're nationalists, that they're America first. But then you look at like Nick Fuentes talk about Venezuela. He comes out in support of regime change in Venezuela. He says, "Well, it's our backyard. Why don't we just gobble all their oil and take it?" Like, it's interesting. It really comes out. Like that's the thing. At the end of the day, about fascism, in its ultranationalism, it undermines the national project by undermining its own nation. Because imperialism often always undermines the nation. It creates overreach. It expands way too much. And then it starts to have, you know, it impoverishes the people inside of it.
Well, I appreciate this historical overview, this deep dive. I must ask.
I know that was a lot. I know that was a lot. But you didn't stop me, so
it was quite a bit. Well, maybe I tried. Let me ask the real practical questions now. Tony, you and I agree as dark centrists. I'm a dark centrist. You're a dark centrist in behavior, but not name. The future is culturally right, economically left. That is the politics that the West should be moving towards. At least that's what I believe. I'm confirming if you believe that or not. What do you think? Because people will call that fascist. And the fascists kind of did do that, right? Like the National Socialists, right-wing culturally, left-wing economically. What is your understanding? What does it mean to be economically left, culturally right? What are the things, what are the characteristics of that ideal type of politics, or practically ideal type of politics?
So first off, I think the zeitgeist, just irrespective of what we think, is moving culturally left, economically right.
Sure.
And see with the election of all these right-wing populist parties. I don't think all the right-wing populists, if not even most, are really fascism. It could devolve into fascism, and it could just devolve into just
chaos.
Period. So, like, what I think is a danger ultimately with right-wing populism and its limitation is that ultimately, like, the left-wing economics of it is not really genuine. I mean, if you look at what fascist regimes did in practice, you know, in Germany, you know, he did distribute land that which was popular. He did, you know, seize nationalized industries largely from Jewish people, and but what he did to his own German workforce is he ended up essentially imposing kind of like a proto form of ultra neoliberalism on steroids, which was like austerity to an extent that no Western power has ever done. Like, it's part of why they were as efficient as they were, as they basically like enslaved everyone. You know, like they made everyone work for scraps. And
sure. Well, that's not the ideal. Well, that's not the ideal. Right. So economically left would not be that.
Well, I'll say like part of why, if you don't actually have a genuine, because genuine socialism has to begin with a workers movement, which workers, I just say work, like, I think I'm not a believer that workers are the only like important class. I think just producers, so workers, small business owners. I even think like highly paid technical skilled workers, people in the professional class, people who are basically not elites.
Yeah, people whose income comes from working rather than investments.
Exactly. Labor. Right? That's the thing.
Labor, not capital. Yeah, not investments.
That's basically the thing. So
right, and as society continues to stratify, you know, from a wealth inequality perspective, with the onset of AI and all that, we're going to need a more left-wing economic approach. And yeah, it's not the vulgar Marxism of just, well, you have to be a factory worker, right, you know, person to be. It's like, no, it's broader than that. Mm-hmm. And so we need that. But let's focus on the culture.
There's a reason why you need that, because if you don't, then you just have the socialism being decided at the mercy of the party in power, which often finds in its interest to actually just become a class of its own. And what it does is, instead of hand power to people, because it doesn't want to, because if you hand power to people, that means you have a more democratic society, which means less power for them. It's not in their interest. It's why all of these, you know, statist socialisms, all of these dictatorial regimes, period, kind of end, you know, in either disaster or just controlled, like a caged, miserable stability. Like, and they can last only by placating the masses through temporary wealth, like China, you know, right now happens to be doing well because it's growing economically. But, you know, we also aren't talking about all the Chinese workers making our iPhones and all of the, you know, doing all the hard work. We only see the wealthier Chinese immigrants who come here and, you know,
yeah, right,
who are, you know, they're doing just fine. They're doing great. They hold up the status quo. Or like Ba'athist regimes, these are also like statist socialisms.
You talking about Saddam Hussein?
Yeah, Saddam Hussein, Assad, Gaddafi, even, who was one of the better ones. But still, I mean, Gaddafi kind of was part of his own destruction. I mean, he handed over the nukes to the West because he collaborated with the West. He collaborated.
Listen, that's why Iran doesn't want to give up their nuclear program, because they saw Gaddafi do it, and it didn't work out for them. Well, hold on.
He collaborated with the West. He invaded Chad. But this is the thing: when it doesn't come from when socialism comes from the top down, what happens when populism comes from the top down, not from the bottom up? What ends up happening is that the people at the top try to placate the masses by invading other countries. You know, so this is how they promise.
Right.
Oh, you'll get richer.
That's no good.
We'll invade the other country. Like, you know, Germany did this. Japan did this when invading China, which was very popular at the time. Or in Italy, they did this. And, you know, all the fucking Ba'athist regimes invaded various countries. This is an old tendency that goes back as far as Caesar. You know, they call it Caesar.
Yeah, right. Exactly. To go and then build a triumph arch and bring back slaves and gold and all that. But hold on. Before we go too far down that direction, broadening it out. Okay, economically left, culturally right. I know you're a Christian. You're not a theocrat. You're not far right. So where do you draw the boundaries on right-wing belief? You know, you're culturally traditionalist, maybe. What is right-wing that you know? What about your beliefs would you describe as right-wing, but not far right?
Sure. I mean, I don't even like to use the word right-wing, because if you look at the old left, they had views that would be considered right-wing by today's standards. Like, you know, the motto of the Labour Party in England used to be called faith, family, and flag. You know, that might sound very fascistic today's standards, right? But it's also why they didn't have Oswald Mosley. Oswald Mosley, the fascist in Italy, in England, I mean, he failed miserably. He didn't get many seats at all in Parliament, and he actually kind of blamed the Labour Party for being the obstacle, to the BUF's growth, the British Union of Fascists. So a lot of the old left had, conservative views, and they weren't called right wing or conservative because for them, progressivism just meant you want equal rights for black people, right? Like that was this equal dignity. It's not like if you believed in civil rights, that was progressive, but you could still be traditionalist. You could still believe in largely like you believe in some degree of family values. You don't believe that the project of progress should be subverting all traditional gender roles, all religion, that sexism, racism, and homophobia, and all these other things all at once. They were focused much more on issues that affected the majority of people, and part of why, like civil rights were seen as important. I mean, it's because it's like, it's a human issue, right? And if you look at Martin Luther King, he had, although in practice he's a whole other story. Martin Luther King's Christian private life is, let's not talk about that. In his rhetoric, Martin Luther King would be a conservative for today's standards at the level of social views, even though he was revolutionary when it came to his like civil rights views. But
you mean Martin Luther King wasn't in favor of gay marriage?
You didn't believe in trans ideology?
A 1960s Southern Baptist minister did not have the most progressive views on marriage equality and gender fluidity.
He didn't believe that there are inherent differences between. He believed that there's inherent differences between men and women.
Careful.
Right.
I already have a strike on my channel for hate speech. We don't want to continue down this line.
Oh boy.
Okay, so that's actually a great. Well, that's a great way to anchor beliefs. It's like, hey, I'm socially conservative, like Martin Luther King.
Like traditionalist, because traditionalism is just the idea that across cultures, not just so. For me, I'm informed by more Christianity, and I think Christianity is not really left or right. I think there's many things that would seem very far left in Christianity at the level of economics, but conservative for sure at the level of social views for today's standards. So it's like, if you look at even G.K. Chesterton or C.S. Lewis, these are proponents of Christianity, important theologians. I mean, they advocate economics that is more or less left-wing, even kind of socialistic, like distribution of property, having relative egalitarian balanced society, not the abolition of all classes, not the abolition of private property, right? Because the thing about the Christian view is we're not naive that humans are inherently good, and that if you just get rid of all structures, we'll have the noble savage be liberated, right? Like this comes from Rousseauianism. I take a very more skeptical view of human nature. I think we need distribution of wealth because I think human nature is bad, not because I think it's good, and that if you get rid of capitalism, we'll be liberated in some sense. The big delusion of a lot of people on the far left, or even like Ted Kaczynski, who thinks he's not a leftist but really is that if you like return to nature, or if you have like communal society. Because societies in the past had there was various societies, indigenous societies, for example, that lived in local communes with relative equality, and that you can just do that at a bigger scale. The thing about what that misses is that almost every indigenous group that might be communistic is traditionalist. That's what's conveniently left out. All cultures have their traditions. They have rules. They have some level of sexual and, cultural morality. They have roles for genders. Sure, there could be some flexibility in there a little bit, but there's usually roles. Strong authority of parents. No culture ever thinks it's a good idea for youth liberation or kids to be able to decide on things without the consent of the parents. No one almost anywhere believes that. There's generally almost every society thinks some kind of marriage is good, right? This is a part of it. Rituals, social glue, and I mean that builds social trust. And social trust is where you can have communism. Now, I don't think at a mass scale you can have communism. That's why I'm not a communist. Local societies can, because they're, culturally and ethnically homogenous, right? You need a similar language, ethnicity, culture, or religion.
It's like the Ben Shapiro line. The more, well, I don't know if Ben Shapiro said it, but like the more local you are, the more communist you can be. With a family, communist. With your neighbors, socialist. With your city, social democrat, and then with your nation, it's more libertarian.
So I don't even know about the nation. I actually think at the nation you could be socialist, or some people might say what I propose is social democracy. I do think it is socialist because it deals with the property question. If you look at social democrats, they believe usually only wealth taxes. I'm skeptical of wealth taxes because it hits all capital at once, and I think you could actually potentially fuck up the economy in the short term if you did that. And
wealth tax is like the worst idea of all time.
Well, it's like it makes sense in theory if everyone imposed it, but like I think it more practically we should just tackle the non-productive forms of capital, which is like property ownership. Like if you don't
Georgism.
Why should, I just think like Georgism is better achieved by a socialist movement. I agree with Georgism, by the way, like very much so. And distributionism, which is, Christian Georgism, you could say to some extent. But it's like, what I also think, gets overlooked by the right the most, and maybe the far left, Marxist-Leninist left, but also especially by the right, actually, it's the big flaw. Overlooking democracy. Because they still think democracy, the purpose of it is to give power, the rule of the people. That's not what it is. That's ancient Athens, and that can only happen like locally. Mm-hmm. It's like communism, right? Democracy in the modern sense is not rule of the people or for the people's interest, because people's interests are very diverse. Democracy is just the distribution of power so that no one can have a monopoly on it. And I believe that's important because, I would say the fantasy at the heart of all authoritarianisms, whether it be fascists or even just ultranationalists, the types who think it'll be a good idea if Trump becomes a dictator, or the people who think Saddam Hussein was the cure to Iraq's problems, or Bolshevik collective dictatorship. The fantasy of all these things is the idea that if you just get the right guy, the guy who agrees, the people who agree with my ideology will fix all the problems. But all people are human, and they'll find it's in their interest to actually not act in the interests of everybody, and they will become a class, they will concentrate power, they'll become corrupt, as they all do. They can do good things at a time. Some can be less evil than others, some can be very good in short periods of time, right? But in the long run, it's not sustainable as a system, and I think you need a distribution of political power, and I would say the same about the economy. If you look at capitalism, it's totally crazy. Like, what is it, like, 1% of the population owns like 80% of the stock market. Just absolute asinine.
Yeah, basic Pareto principle, but yes.
Yeah, which is
problematic.
You could say hierarchies, I do think actually are inherent to some degree in human nature. And the whole thing in Christianity is not, this is, I think, Jordan Peterson's flaw. Maybe if I want to push one of your guys, Jordan Peterson often says, hierarchies are natural, and I would say, yeah, I agree with them, but that doesn't mean you should just let everything as it is. I mean, part of the whole point of Christianity is creating rules to regulate humanity because we're so fucked. We're flawed.
Right.
Excuse my language, right? But this is the truth. I mean, what is the whole point of Satan as an allegory? It's the force that ultimately undermines humans, leads self-destruction of humans, whether it be excessive lust, excessive consumption, temptation of power, and power tempts us to do evil. And you look at capitalism. I cannot see how anyone could not see capitalism as, a fundamentally highly satanic force, in that the whole motto is profiting on basically making money from people's worst impulses. Lust, power, distraction, getting people addicted and brainwashing them through fucking witchcraft to sell people's bullshit. It's insanity.
The embrace of hedonism and vice. Yeah. I think people would point out you can have.
I'm not against markets.
Yeah, that's what people would say.
Free exchange, I'm fine with markets.
You can have a capitalist system
or a market system without capitalism. That's
that's fair. Tony, we're coming up on an hour.
Anything you want to say?
This has been rich. What is anything I want to say? Well, I think that I'm reading the book Why Liberalism Failed by Patrick Deneen. and it gets boring after a few chapters. But the beginning of it is good, where he lays out the basic problem, of our conception of liberty is essentially hedonism. I mean, that's not, he wouldn't phrase it that way. That's how I'm phrasing it. Just unrestricted freedom, basically. And that's a problem, like you said. It's satanic almost, of like, buy OnlyFans, monetize friendship, monetize human intimacy, monetize everything, commodify everything. That's a liberal impulse because we're free to do that. You have the liberty to do that. It's like, that's not what liberty was supposed to mean. And I think a lot of our problems are the result of this liberal excess, this liberal malaise, I believe is a term I've seen you associated with or use or something like that.
Of course.
And so getting at that is the project of the dark centrist. Whether it's culturally right, economically left, whether it's why liberalism failed.
Yeah, I have some thoughts on it.
Well, why don't you share in brief here as we close up here? What's your 3 minutes?
How much time do we have?
5 minutes.
Okay, damn, that's short as hell. But it'll be better for the.
I got videos. Maybe we could do a separate. Maybe we could do a separate conversation on just why liberalism failed.
Sure. Yeah.
Should we save it?
Yeah, because I think I like his critique, but he gives it alternatives insufficient. I mean,
he doesn't give an alternative as far as I can tell.
I'll give a foreshadow maybe to the next conversation. So, what I think Patrick Deneen in that book, Why Liberalism Failed, is very correct in identifying is this spiritual decay of liberalism, because at its core, liberalism has a limited idea of freedom, which is based on freedom from interference, as opposed to freedom to positive conception of it. It's also, moral relativism is something he critiques. A lot of thinkers in the past have critiqued this. In liberalism, people often give up on the conception of what the good society is or what even objective truths or morals are. So with that, you have a huge spiritual decay. And, Leo Strauss in his book and in his essay on nihilism actually identified this as one of the causes of fascism. It's like not the only cause of fascism, as fascism is also, a product of the decline of the economy. When socialists say fascism is capitalism and decay, well, it's like, to me, that's also, it's like, well, there's a spiritual crisis too, and that affected many places. They didn't all have to respond in the fascist way. Many responded in different ways, right? But with the spiritual decay is huge. I mean, because this is really crucial, I think. When you don't have a positive conception of the good life, you can't really defend values, and you end up with a contradictory basket case where at the same time you want to defend freedom to engage in whatever sexual proclivity you could possibly imagine, but also say that the burqa is fine. Wearing the Islamic burqa is fine.
Yeah,
and
right.
It's like, that is so at odds, right?
Mm-hmm.
But like, you see liberals will often find themselves kind of cross-eyed when trying to talk about these issues. And that is part of it, but it's also like a lack of general meaning. I mean, it's part of why I think even a lot of the resurrection of Catholicism is in this sort of parody form. Like, a lot of people engage with Christianity in a kind of mimetic online way.
Yeah. Like the trad cath online thing. The Pope even said this specifically.
Even called it out. Yeah, the Pope called it out. Where it's funny because it's like this idea of, it's like, I just started Christianity today. It's like saying I started like no.
Yeah, going to the gym or something. Right? Yeah.
But Christianity is meaningful insofar as you actually practice it with other people. Like, you go to church and you develop a community of some sort, and you have those. You ultimately like. You also believe in you take the principles seriously. That's a thing even a lot of Christians are guilty of not doing, but that's important. With Patrick Deneen's critique, where I think this will foreshadow the next thing, what I think it misses is, while liberalism is limited in its conception of liberty, I don't think he gives actually what is a very good alternative, which I think is in the Republican tradition. And the Civic Republican tradition, which has a tradition in the United States from the Founding Fathers, and the Founding Fathers borrowed it from thinkers like James Harrington, who espoused Georgist ideas, if you read his book Oceana way back in the 1500s. And Machiavelli as well had ideas of this sort. and you have like the republicanism goes deep, but republicanism is basically based on the idea of freedom is non-domination, not freedom to just do whatever. Like, yeah, you can be a freedom to destroy your life. Okay, cool. It's why libertarians who would take this view of freedom to its extreme, both on left and right, they end up saying like, oh, why don't we just like legalize all sex work, all drugs? Why don't we just like have it all? Like, just why not? It's individual's choice, right? And no, I think freedom really is freedom from domination. This is what freedom is meaningful. Like, do you actually have some level of autonomy in your life? That's why it was the Republican Party, which was started in the 1800s, which was the most radical party in the U.S. history, and it was what championed slave abolition. After that, it championed labor republicanism. That was
Donald Trump, the three greatest American
Republican Party today is totally
movements.
Divorced from Republican.
The abolition of slavery, the advancement of labor unions, and the MAGA movement, the three greatest political achievements in American history.
Yeah.
That's fair. We'll cover more in our next conversation.
Because republicanism is collectivistic. It's also it has an emphasis on citizenship. That meaning, like, what you want is not to give out citizenship more easily. You actually want to have that citizenship mean more.
Yes.
You want to have people participate more in their society. So they believe in a certain level of more democracy for the citizens.
Civic nationalism.
Exactly. And it's also not racial based. I mean, like, part of it is like you should immerse yourself in the country. You should learn the culture. You should be active in it, be active with the community. But it's based on ideas. It's not based on like race. The big thing though is Republicans are restrictive of citizenship. So like they don't believe like, oh, you should just like have a bunch of people import them illegally, definitely not illegally, and to do cheap labor just because it's good for businesses to hire cheap labor. And even they also wouldn't take the leftist approach, which is let's just fix it all by making everyone a citizen. They would say, okay, well, maybe we can do that with a certain degree of immigrants, but that's just impossible at a mass scale. Like at a large scale, integration is very hard, especially if they're all coming from the same ethnic groups. You want it to be diverse,
right,
slow paced, so that people can integrate and have time to be citizens. Kind of like, how, I'm half Lebanese and my, I'm much more Canadian than I am anything else, even though I am also a U.S. citizen, but I'm ultimately Canadian, Canada first. I am Canada first. God. I grew up here.
Disgusting.
And, but like, look, I also think there's great things about America. I think we have America and Canada are great partially because they have these founded on ideas, principles. And I think those ideas can be used to build the sort of, you could say, well, you call it dark centrism. I don't like that term, as you know, but that project, because like, look, if we have something that's already worth looking at, that's in the traditions of our countries, we should look at that instead of just try to go to some mythical past.
Yeah, and LARPing as all these other
or importing
ideologies.
Foreign ideology like Duginism or some weird esoteric fascism.
Screw these foreign ideologies. Yeah.
Leninism,
I'm not a xenophobe of people. I'm a xenophobe of ideologies. I don't like foreign ideas. I love foreign people. I don't like foreign ideas. We got to wrap it up here. Tony, next time. Why liberalism failed and what will replace it.
Hell yeah. Check out One Dime Radio and the One Dime channel. One Dime channel if you want essays on ideology and the economy. The One Dime Radio if you like conversations more like this. One Dime Radio podcast is something you will definitely like. I would recommend the episode I did in particular called Fascism, Bonapartism, and Caesarism, where I explain this, my understanding of fascism in detail with another great guest.
Mr. Varn, yes, that was fascinating. All right, sir.